Section 60 of A History of the Great War, Volume 3. The Beleaguered Forest Continued and the Great Sallies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Great War, Volume 3, by John Buchan. Chapter 82, The Third Battle of Ypres, June 1st to November 10th, 1917, Part 2. 2. The preliminary work of Messina was over by 12th June, but it was not till late in July that the day for the major advance could be fixed. The breakout from the Ypres Salient was the residuum left to Haig of the Great Flanders Offensive, which should have begun before the end of April. The preparation for it had been impeded by the necessity of turning his attention to other areas, and when at last his hands seemed free, new obstacles arose which meant further postponements. To increase his reserves, he begged the French to take over part of his defensive front. This they were unable to do, but asked that they should have a hand in the Flanders attack, which Haig reluctantly conceded. His own and Joffre's fears were justified. France was averse to facing the truth that her armies should be left for some time to the role of the defensive. She wished to share in any advance, but yet could not take the responsibility for it, and at the same time would not shorten the front of Britain, on whom the onus of the offensive fell. There were many discussions and weary delays before Anthony brought the French First Army to the British left from Boussingault, northward, and the best of the summer weather was lost. The plan, as it was finally put into action, bristled with difficulties which might have been deterred a less stout-hearted commander than Sir Douglas Haig. It was in some degree a race against time. If a true strategic purpose was to be effected before winter, the first stages must be quickly passed. The high ground east of the salient must be won in a fortnight to enable the British to move against the German bases in West Flanders and clear the coastline. Moreover, it was now evident that the Russian front was crumbling. Already divisions and batteries had come westward, and those left behind had been skimmed for shock troops. Soon the process would proceed more rapidly, and the British would be faced with an accumulation of reserves strong enough to bar their way. Again, the nature of the terrain made any offensive a gamble with the weather. A dry autumn like that of 1914 would be well enough, but a repetition of the Somme experience must spell disaster. The salient was, after Verdun, the most tortured of the western battlefields. Constant shelling of the low ground west of the ridges had blocked or diverted the streams and the natural drainage and turned it into a sodden wilderness. Much rain would make of it a morass where tanks could not be used, and transport could scarcely move, and troops would be exposed to the last degree of misery. Finally, it was ill ground to debouch from, for though we had won the Messina's height, the enemy still held the slopes which, in semicircular tiers, rise to the main ridge of Passac-Daly, and had direct observation over all the land west to the canal and the ruins of Ypres. Whatever might be the strength and skill of the Germans, they were less formidable than the barriers which nature herself might place in the British path. But the commander of the German Fourth Army was no despicable antagonist. He had suffered a sharp defeat at Messina, but he had the type of mind which reacts against failure, and, as on the Somme a year before, he set himself to adapt his defense to the British mode of attack. During the first half of 1917, the enemy's major plan had been that of retirement through various fortified zones. He was still strictly on the defensive, and his aim was to allow the Allies to waste their strength in making small territorial gains which had no real strategic value. He had successively lost all his most important observation points, but he had still, on most parts of his front, those immense entrenchments, constructed largely by the labor of Russian prisoners, which could only be captured piecemeal after a great expense of shells. In Flanders, the nature of the ground did not permit of a second Siegfried line. Deep dugouts and concrete-lined trenches were impossible because of the waterlogged soil, and he was compelled to find new tactics. Armand's solution was the pillbox, which we have already noted at Mehedi. These were small concrete forts, sited among the ruins of a farm or in some derelict piece of woodland, often raised only a yard or two above the ground level, and bristling with machine guns. The low entrance was at the rear, and the ordinary pillbox held from 20 to 40 men. It was easy to make, for the wooden or steel framework could be brought up on any dark night and filled with concrete. They were echeloned in depth with great skill, and in the wiring, alleys were left so that an unwary advance would be trapped among them and exposed to enfilading fire. Their small size made them a difficult mark for heavy guns, and since they were protected by concrete at least 3 feet thick, they were impregnable to the ordinary barrage of field artillery. The enemy's plan was to hold his first line, which was often a mere string of shell craters linked by a trench, with few men who would fall back before an assault. He had his guns well behind, so they should not be captured in the first rush, and would be available for a barrage when his opponents were entangled in the pillbox zone. Finally, he had his reserves in the second line, ready for the counterstroke before the attack could secure the ground won. It would be seen that these tactics were admirably suited for the exposed and contorted ground of the salient. Any attack would be allowed to make some advance, but if the German plan worked well, this advance would be short-lived and would be dearly paid for. Instead of the cast iron front of the Siegfried area, the Flanders line would be highly elastic, but would spring back into position after pressure with a deadly rebound. Footnote: just before the battle, the Germans used 2 new and deadly forms of gas in their Blue Cross and Yellow Cross shell. The progress of the gas weapon since the German use of chlorine in April 1915 deserves a brief note. The first step was to use in cloud attacks a preparation of phosgene, a more deadly gas, and develop gas shells which had the advantage of being independent of the wind. Early in 1917, they introduced a lethal gas shell, Green Cross, containing diphosgene, and a variant, Green Cross 1, containing 50% of chlorpicrin. In July 1917, Blue Cross shell appeared containing a non-persistent gas made from arsenic compounds, and Yellow Cross shell containing dichloroethyl sulfide, which had practically no smell and could remain for days on the surface of the ground. This latter, which we called mustard gas, was far the deadliest gas which the enemy evolved. In 1917, Germany was turning out 1 million gas shells a month. On the Allied side, the defense was very soon perfected, and the British box respirator was a complete protection against the ordinary gas cloud and the Green Cross and Blue Cross shell. At first, chlorine was the only gas which Britain could produce, and our production of gas shells was slow in developing. We did not get mustard gas of our own till September 1918. Our most efficient form of gas offensive was probably the Livens projector, a kind of rude trench mortar lobbing heavy gas bombs, which was first used towards the close of the Battle of the Somme. End of footnote. The new offensive involved a complete redistribution of the Allied forces. The front of the Third Army under Julian Byng, who had succeeded to Allenby's command, was greatly extended, and now covered all the ground between Arras and the junction with the French. This released Sir Hugh Bigoff's Fifth Army and Sir Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army for service in the north. In early June, French troops had held the front on the Yser between St. George and the sea. These were now relieved by the British Fourth Army. The Belgian forces on the canal drew in their right from Bosigny, to Nordschute, and that section was occupied by the French First Army of 6 divisions under Anthoin, who had commanded the 6th Army in spring in the Moron-Villers battle. From Bosingi to the Zilbeki-Zandvoorte road southeast of Ypres lay the British 5th Army, and on its right, the 2nd Army as far as the Lys. From Armentières to Arras, Sir Henry Horne's 1st Army held the front. The main striking forces were Gough's and Anthoin's, but it was intended that Horne should undertake by way of distraction certain movements against Lens, and that Plumer should threaten to the south of the salient so as to compel the enemy to distribute his artillery fire. The appearance of Rawlinson on the coast in the second half of June gravely alarmed the German command. It seemed to indicate an attack along the shore, assisted by our fleet at sea, which had long been a favorite subject of German speculation. They resolved to anticipate it by depriving the British of their bridgehead east of the canalized Yser. The dunes formed a belt of dry land along the coast about a mile wide, where movement was possible in any weather. But south of them lay a flat country crisscrossed with streams and ditches which could easily be flooded so as to bar the advance of an enemy. The Allied line, which, from Dixmude northward lay on the west bank of the Yser, crossed to the east bank, south of Newport. This gave us a bridge end about 2 miles long and from 6 to 1,200 yards deep, from the Plagendale Canal south of Lombard City to the sea. Halfway, a dike known as the Gletty Creek intersected our front. If the enemy could drive us across the Yser, he would have a stronger defensive position in the event of a coastal advance. Very early in the morning of Tuesday, 10th July, an intense bombardment broke out against the bridgehead. There was a heavy gale blowing, which accounted for the absence of British naval support. In the dune and polder country, trenches were impossible, and the British defense consisted of breastworks built in the sand. These were speedily flattened out, and all the bridges across the Yser north of the Galita dike were destroyed, as well as the bridges over the dike itself. The bombardment continued all day, and at 6:30 in the evening, troops of a German naval division advanced in 3 waves. The bridgehead between the Galita Creek and the shore was held by 2 battalions of the 1st Division, the 1st Northamptons, and the 2nd King's Royal Rifles. Since all communications were destroyed, they were unable to fall back, and for an hour, against overwhelming numbers, and in positions from which all cover had gone, they maintained a most gallant defense. By 8 o'clock the action was over, and the 2 battalions had disappeared as units, though during that and the following night some 70 men and 4 officers managed to swim the Yser and return to our lines. The northern part of the bridgehead was captured, but south of the Galita dike, opposite Lombard City, where our position had greater depth, and some of the Yser bridges were still intact, the assault was held, and the enemy driven out of our lines by a counterattack. The affair was trivial and easily explicable. The bridgehead was at the mercy of a sudden attack in force unless we had chosen to take very special measures to defend it. It was another instance of what the past 2 years had abundantly proved, that any advanced trench system could be taken by the side which was prepared to mass sufficient troops and guns. Meantime, through July, the preparations for the great Salient battle were being assiduously pressed on. The shell of Ypres did not provide, either above ground or underground, the cover for the assembly of troops which Arras had afforded. Consequently, the labors of our tunneling companies were heavy and incessant. Our aircraft did marvelous work in locating enemy batteries, and our guns in destroying them. So good was our counter-battery work that the enemy frequently withdrew his guns, and thus compelled us to postpone our attack in order that the new positions might be located. All through July our bombardment continued, till every corner of the salient was drenched with our fire. We made constant raids and gas attacks, the latter with deadly effect. And it is worth noting that the place where the enemy seems to have suffered most from this weapon was precisely the region astride the Polt-Capelle Road, where in April 1915 he had made his first gas attack on the French and the Canadians. Towards the end of the month, there were signs that Ahmed might upset our plans by a withdrawal to his rear defenses, and we had to keep jealous watch on the enemy's movements. On July 27th, in the Bosingi area, it was discovered that his front trenches were unoccupied and that he had fallen back some distance, whether out of fear of mines like those at Messines or from the sheer weight of our bombardment. Antoine's right wing and Gough's left accordingly crossed the canal and occupied the German front and support lines on a front of 3,000 yards. They held their ground till the attack began and managed by night to throw 17 bridges across the canal in their rear. The front of attack was 15 miles long, from the Lys River to a little north of Steenstraate, but the main effort was planned for the 7.5 miles between Bosinga and the Zillebeke-Zandvoort Road. The Allied line ran from the canal in a curve southeastward through the village of Wiltje and along the foot of the low slope, which may be defined by the points Pilkum, Belwaarde, Hooge, and Sanctuary Wood. Thence it ran south across the Ypres Salient Canal to the Oosterveen line, and thence to the Lys opposite La Paz Via. It was the business of the French to clear the land between the canal and that mysterious creek which in its lowest reaches is called the Markt Javart, and farther up the St. John's Peak. Their right had to cover much ground, for it had to keep pace with Gough's left. The task of the British Fifth Army was, by a series of bounds, to capture the enemy's first defenses situated on the forward slope of the rising ground, and his second position sighted along the crest, and at the same time to secure the crossings of the Steenapeak. The muddy ditch, which flows from St. Julian to join the St. Jansbeck, northeast of Bixschoote. If this could be done at once and the weather favored, a strong defensive flank could be formed for a breakthrough in the direction of Thorough towards the northeast. In the Fifth Army were 4 corps of assault, from left to right, the 14th under Lord Cavan, the Guards and 38th Divisions, the 18th under Lieutenant General Ivor Maxey, 51st and 39th Divisions, the 19th under Lieutenant General Watts, 55th and 15th Divisions, and the 2nd under Lieutenant General Jacob, 8th, 18th, 30th, and 24th Divisions. The Second Army on their right had a strictly limited objective. Its right was ordered to take La Basse-Ville on the Lys, and its left to capture Hollenbeck village and clear the difficult ground north of the bend of the Ypres-Comines Canal and east of Battle Wood. Against the British attack alone, the enemy had 13 divisions in line, including the 3rd Guard Division and 4th Battalion, the 4th, 10th, 16th, and 6th Reserve. The last week of July was dull, cloudy weather, with poor visibility for air work. On the morning of Monday the 30th came a heavy thunderstorm, and rain fell in the afternoon. All day the Allied bombardment continued at its height, and during the drizzling night, the rain stopped towards dawn, but a thick mist remained, and the ground was plashy, and the skies overcast as 0 hour drew near. There was a short lull in the firing after 3, but precisely at 3:50 a.m. on the 31st, the whole Allied front broke into flame. Under cover of discharges of thermite and blazing oil and a barrage of exceptional weight, the infantry crossed their parapets, and the battle began. The whole of the German front position fell at once. Antoine crossed the canal and took Steenstraate. Furlenhoek fell to the 15th Division, which that day added to a record of victories which included Martinpuch and Fuji. Farther south, pushing through Sanctuary Wood and Shrewsbury Forest, we carried the Chateau of Huge and the Lake of Bellewaerde, and came to the foot of that lift of the Mernon Road, which was the pillar of the enemy's position on the heights. The Allies then pressed on to the attack on the second position, and by 9 in the morning the whole of it north of Westhope was in their hands. Fresenberg, after a stubborn fight, was won by the 15th Division. The 39th Division troops entered St. Julian, and the 38th Welsh Division took Pilkem and annihilated the Fusilier Regiment of the 3rd Prussian Guard. Palmen Redoubt, north of Fresenberg, was won by the 55th Division of West Lancashire Territorials. The 51st Highland Territorials and the Guard seized the crossings of the Steenebeek. In a captured German document which provided a blacklist of the British divisions, the 51st was given first place, and the enemy that day had no reason to revise his judgment. On the center and left of our attack, all our final objectives had been gained, and at 1 or 2 points we had gone beyond them. The French, for example, took Bixschoote. The Guards advanced beyond the Steenebeek, and at one point in our center we reached and penetrated the enemy's third trench system, that known as the Gulevelt-Langemarck line. More slow and difficult was the fighting on the right of the Fifth Army along the Menin Road. Stirling Castle, the strong point which dominated Ypres south of the highway, was taken, but before the shell-shattered patches called Glencore's Wood and Inverness Copse, the enemy had massed strongly for defense, but they were the key of his whole position, and the attacking brigades, Lancashire, Irish, and Scots, clung with difficulty to their footing on the ridge, but could go no farther. In the afternoon, when a downpour of rain had begun to fall, the enemy counterattacked from south of the Menin Road to north of St. Julian. In spite of poor visibility owing to the thick weather, our artillery held them, though we had to fall back from all but the western skirts of Westhope. Our advanced troops north of St. Julian were also, for the most part, withdrawn to the line of the Steenebeek. By the evening, the position was that everywhere we had carried the German first line, and had gained all the crest of the first ridge, and so denied the enemy observation over the salient. From Westhope to St. Julian we had taken the German second line, and north of St. Julian were well beyond it. On 2/3 of our front in the salient, we had won our first objectives, while, of the remaining third, we had just fallen short of our extreme aim on one half, and on the other had exceeded it. On the whole battlefield we had taken over 6,000 prisoners, including 133 officers. It was no small triumph for an attack in foul weather over some of the most difficult country in which armies ever fought. The subsidiary action fought by the Second Army was an unbroken success. On the right, after a 50-minute struggle, the New Zealand Division had carried La Basse-Ville. Northward as far as Hollenbeck, we confined ourselves to advancing our front a few hundred yards to a line of strong points and fortified farms. On Plumer's left, the 41st Division pushed half a mile down the valley of the Roselbeck, and on one side of the Ypres-Comonis Canal took the village of Hollenbeck, and on the other the rubble heap which had been Klein-Zillebeck. Once again, after 3 years, we held that classic soil where, at the close of a dark November day, Cavanagh's brigade of guards and Kavanagh's dismounted household cavalry had turned the last wave of the German assault. According to plan, the next day should have seen a second blow with cumulative force, but the weather had joined the enemy. From midday on 1st August, for 4 days and 4 nights, without intermission, fell the rain. Even when it stopped on the 5th, there followed days of somber skies and wet mists and murky clouds. The misery of our troops, huddled in their impromptu lines or strung out in shell holes, cannot be pictured in words. nor can the supreme disappointment of the High Command. After months of thought and weeks of laborious preparation, just when a brilliant start had been made, they saw their hopes dashed to the ground. An offensive was still possible, but it could not be the offensive planned. The time schedule was fatally dislocated. The situation is best described in the unemotional words of Sir Douglas Haig's dispatch. The low-lying, clayey soil, torn by shells and sodden by rain, turned to a succession of vast muddy pools. The valleys of the choked and overflowing streams were speedily transformed into long stretches of bog, impassable except by a few well-defined tracks, which became marks for the enemy's artillery. To leave these tracks was to risk death by drowning, and in the course of the subsequent fighting on several occasions, both men and pack animals were lost in this way. In these conditions, operations of any magnitude became impossible, and the resumption of our offensive was necessarily postponed until a period of fine weather should allow the ground to recover, as had been the case in the Ypres battle. This unavoidable delay in the development of our offensive was of the greatest service to the enemy. Valuable time was lost. The troops opposed to us were able to recover from the disorganization produced by our first attack, and the enemy was given the opportunity to bring up reinforcements. For a fortnight we held our hand. To advance was a stark impossibility till the countryside was a little drier, for though we had won positions on the heights, our communications ran through the spongy salient. The enemy's counterattacks were to some extent also crippled by the weather. Those on the night of the first day of the battle were aimed at driving us off the high ground north of the Menin Road and regaining his second-line system between Fresenberg and St. Julien. They failed to shake us, but it was considered wise, in order to escape the heavy shelling, to withdraw our men temporarily from St. Julien itself, though we still held a bridgehead on the Steenebeck, north of the village. On 3rd August we reoccupied St. Julien and consolidated our positions on the right bank of the Steenebeck by a line of points which linked us with the French. On 10th August, we took the whole of Westhoek, and thereby won the last point in the old German second position which gave any chance of observation over Ypres. There the enemy counterattacked violently and fruitlessly on the 2 following days. Meantime, the French had cleared the ground around the Corsica Cabaret and its famous crossroads, and had forced their way well across the peninsula between the Yser Canal and the Marge of Art. In the middle of the month, there was a short break in the storms, and Haig took advantage of it for a new attack. He began by a highly successful subsidiary action in the south, designed to threaten an important position of the enemy and prevent him massing all his strength before the salient. We have seen how, during the Battle of Arras and the lesser operations of July, the Canadian Corps had eaten into the defenses of Lens from the south and southwest. The new attack came from the northeast, on a front of 4,000 yards, on a line southeast of Loos, running roughly from the Lens-Bethune Road to the Bois Hugo. On September 15, 1915, at the Battle of Loos, troops of the 15th Division had swarmed across Hill 70, east of the village, and some had even penetrated into Cité Saint-Auguste, the mining suburb of Lens beyond the railway line. The latter never returned. The Hill 70, after a gallant defense against odds, was relinquished before the close of the battle. Ever since then, the place had been a thorn in our side, but gave the enemy good observation. On 15th August at 4:25 in the morning, the Canadians swept over Hill 70, and south of it crossed the Lens-la-Bassée Road, and took the faubourgs of Cité Saint-Laurent and Cité Saint-Emile. North of it they won the little Bois Rosé and the western half of the Bois Hugo. All their objectives were gained, except a short length of trench west of Cité Saint-Auguste, which fell the following afternoon. During the morning of the 15th, counterattacks by the German local reserves were easily beaten off, and in the evening, a division of the German Guard was thrown in without better success. It was caught in the open by the deadly rifle and machine gun fire of the Canadians. From the 3 German divisions opposed to us that day, we took 1,120 prisoners. Next day, the 16th, saw the second stage of the Ypres struggle. The Fifth Army was directed against the German third position, the Gulevelt-Langemarck line, which ran from the Menin Road along the second of the tiers of ridges which rimmed the salient on the east. These tiers, the highest and most easterly, of which was the famous Passchendaele crest, had the common features that they all sprang from one southern boss or pillar. The point on the Menin Road marked 64 meters, which we knew as Chapin Junction, and all, as they ran northward, lost elevation. The day was destined to show at its best Armand's new defensive methods. The weather was still thick and damp, making aerial observation difficult, and therefore depriving us of timely notice of the enemy's counterattacks. His front was sown with pillboxes, the tactical device which as yet we scarcely understood, and had not found a weapon to meet. The ground was sloppy, and made tangled and difficult with broken woods. The conditions were ideal for the practice of that method which Armand had foreshadowed at Messines, and had now definitely embraced, that system of elastic defense, in the words of the official dispatch, in which his forward trench lines were held only in sufficient strength to disorganize the attack, while the bulk of his forces were kept in close reserve, ready to deliver a powerful and immediate blow which might recover the positions overrun by our troops before we had had time to consolidate them. The attack took place at dawn 4:45 a.m., and on the Allies' left and left center had an immediate success. The French cleared the whole peninsula between the Ypres Canal and the Marche Javart, and, wading through deep floods, captured the strongly fortified bridgehead of Drie-Grachten. The British left, the 29th and 20th Divisions, pressed on beyond the Big Chute-Langemarck Road, and took the hamlet of Wittendrift. At first, they were checked in the outskirts of Langemarck, but by 8 o'clock they held the village, and by 9 they had won their final objective, the portion of the German third-line system half a mile farther north. But very different was the fate of the British centre, north and northeast of St. Julien, and between the Vichy, Passchendaele, and the Ypres-Zambecki roads. It came up against the full strength of the pillboxes. A number fell to us, and all day we struggled on in the mud, losing heavily from the concealed machine gun fire. In some places our men reached their final objectives, but they could not abide in them. Enemy counterattacks later in the morning forced us back, and at the close of the day we were little beyond our starting point. Our Langemarck gains were, however, secured, but the 55th, 48th, and 11th Divisions had established a defensive flank on a line from east of Langemarck to north of St. Julien. On the British right, the fighting was still more desperate. On the Menin Road, we had already passed the highest point, Hill 64, and were moving on the wood of Herrenthak, which we called Inverness Copse, and which lay on the slopes toward Gulevelt. This wood was intersected by the highway, and north of it lay the Nonnensbosch, with its southern outlier, which we knew as Glencorse Wood. East of Glencorse Wood was the big Polygon Wood, with the remains of a racecourse in the heart of it. In all this area, our advance was most stubbornly contested, and at the end of the action we had done no more than gain a fraction of the western edge of Glencorse Wood, and advance a little way north of Westhoek, taking the battleground as a whole. As a result of the day, we had made a considerable gap in the British third line, and taken over 2,000 prisoners and 30 guns. The rest of the month was one long downpour, We made a few small gains, notably on the 19th, 22nd, and 27th, when, with the assistance of tanks, we improved our position on a 2-mile front between St. Julian and the Ypres Rulers Railway, and took a number of strong points and fortified farms. On the 22nd, we also attacked along the Menin Road, and after 6 days' continuous fighting, made some way in Glencorse Wood, and won the western edge of Inverness Copse. End of Chapter 82, Part 2. Section 61 of the History of the Great War, Volume 3. The Beleaguered Forest continued in the Great Sallies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Great War, Volume 3, by John Buchan. Chapter 82. The Third Battle of Ypres, June 1st to November 10th, 1917, Part 3. This second stage of the battle was beyond doubt a serious British check. We had encountered a new tactical device of the enemy, and it had defeated us. The Fifth Army had fought with the most splendid gallantry, but its courage had been largely fruitless. We had beyond doubt caused the enemy serious losses, but he had taken a heavier toll of our own ranks. 5 brigades had been hurled in succession against a concrete wall, and had been sorely battered. For almost the first time of the campaign, there was a sense of discouragement abroad on our front. Men felt that they were being sacrificed blindly, that every fight was a soldier's fight, and that such sledgehammer tactics were too crude to meet the problem. For a moment there was a real ebb of confidence in British leadership. That such a feeling should exist among journalists and politicians matters little, but it matters much if it is found among troops in the field. Especially the reputation of Sir Hubert Gough was affected, and the trust of the Fifth Army in its commander was shaken. He is believed to have shown himself a little stiff and unresourceful, a repute which was to have an unfortunate effect upon the career of a most gallant soldier. 7 months later he suffered the consequences of this unpopularity by being relieved of his command after a battle for which he deserved only praise. Haig accordingly brought upon the scene the man who was rapidly coming to recognition as the most accomplished of army commanders. The front of the Second Army was extended northward, and Sir Herbert Plumer took over the attack upon the southern portion of the enemy front on the Menin Road. The better part of a month was spent in preparation, while Plumer patiently thought out the problem. Sorely tried, too sorely tried, divisions were taken out of the line to rest, and the dispositions on the whole front of assault were readjusted. Especially our artillery tactics were revised in order to cope with the pillboxes. In the early days of September, the weather improved, and the sodden salient began slowly to dry. That is to say, the mud hardened into something like the seracs of a glacier, and the streams became streams again, and not lagoons. But the process was slow, and it was not till the 3rd week of the month that the next stage in the battle could begin. The new 8-mile front of attack ran from the Ypres-Stade Railway north of Langenmark to the Ypres-Comines Canal north of Hollebeck. On the left and center, our objectives were narrowly limited, averaging about 3/4 of a mile. But Plumer, on the right, had the serious task of pushing for a mile along the Menin Road. The pillbox problem had been studied, and a solution, it was believed, had been found, not by miraculous ingenuity, but by patience and care. The little fortalices had been methodically reconnoitered, and our heavy barrage so arranged as to cover each mark. Even when a direct hit was not attained, it was believed that the concussion of the great shells might loosen some of the lesser structures, while fumes, smoke, and gas would make the life of the inmates difficult. One famous division followed with complete success another plan. Having located the pillbox, the field gun barrage lengthened on both sides of it, which enabled the advancing troops hugging their barrage to get round its unprotected rear. Wednesday, 19th September, was a clear blowing day, but at 9 o'clock in the evening the rain began and fell heavily all that night. At dawn the drizzle stopped, but a wet mist remained, which blinded our air reconnaissance. At 5:40 a.m. on the 20th the attack was launched. Presently the fog cleared, and the sun came out, and our airplanes were able to fight in line with the infantry, attacking enemy trenches and the concentrations with machine gun fire. The ground was knee-deep in mud, but the whole British line pressed forward. The Fifth Armies left north of the Sonnebeck-Langemarck Road. The 47th and 51st Divisions won all its objectives by midday. South of them, the 55th was not less successful in the appalling mud southeast of St. Julian. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement was that of the Scottish and South African brigades of the 9th Division, which, advancing on both sides of the Ypres Roulers Railway, won their final objectives in 3 hours. They carried a line of fortified farms, the 2 important redoubts called Sonnebeck and Bremen, and the hamlet of Zenenkot. The crux of the battle lay in the area of the Second Army, and the vital point was the work of its center along the Menin Road. There lay the key of the enemy's position, and there in defense he had already sent in 16 divisions. That day the fighting was extended well south of the high road. Plumer's right, the 19th Division, cleared the small woods north of the Ypres Canal. Farther north, the 39th and 41st Divisions pushed through the eastern fringe of Shrewsbury Forest, across the stream called the Basilisk, which drains to the Lice, with its hideous cluster of ponds called Dumbarton Lakes, and up the slopes of the Tower Hamlet Spur, on the eastern side of which lay Gelderveld. Here they encountered heavy machine gun fire from the ridge between Veldhoek and the Tower Hamlets. On their left, the 23rd Division had been brilliantly successful. It had carried the whole of infamous Corps, and had captured Veldhoek itself, as a result of which late in the day we were able to establish ourselves across the Tower Hamlet Spur. The Australians, on Plumer's left, had for their first task the clearing of the rest of the Glencorse Wood and the Nonnenbosch. This they achieved early in the morning, and by 10 a.m. had taken Polygonveld, at the northwestern corner of the great Polygon Wood. For a little they were held up at Blackwatch Corner, at the southwestern angle, but by midday they had passed it, and had secured the whole western half of the wood up to the racecourse, thus reaching their final objectives. This day's battle cracked the kernel of the German defense in the salient. It showed a limited advance, and the total of 3,000 prisoners had been often exceeded in a day's fighting. But every inch of the ground won was vital. We had carried the southern pillar on which the security of the Passchendaele Ridge depended. Few struggles in the campaign were more desperate or carried out on a more gruesome battlefield. The maze of quagmires, splintered woods, ruined husks of pillboxes, water-filled shell holes, and foul creeks which made up the land on both sides of the Menin Road was a sight which, to the recollection of most men, must seem like a fevered nightmare. It was the classic soil on which, during the first Battle of Ypres, the 1st and 2nd Divisions had stayed the German rush for the Channel. Then it had been broken, but still recognizable and featured countryside. Now the elements seemed to have blended with each other to make of it a limbo outside mortal experience, and almost beyond human imagining. Only on some of the contorted hills of Verdun could a parallel be found. The Battle of 20th September was a proof to what heights of endurance the British soldier may attain. It was an example, too, of how thought and patience may achieve success in spite of every disadvantage of weather, terrain, and enemy strength. Armin could not accept meekly the losses of the 20th. That afternoon and evening he made no less than 11 counterattacks. Most of them failed, but east of St. Julien he retook a farm, which we did not win back till the next day. Northeast of Langemarck, a short length of German trench held out till the 23rd. On the 21st, and for the 4 days following, he attacked northeast of St. Julien, and very fiercely on the front between the Tower Hamlets and the Polygon Wood. On the 25th, the Germans got into our lines north of the Menin Road, but after a struggle of many hours, the 33rd and the 5th Australian Divisions succeeded in ejecting them. In the meantime, preparations were being hastened on for the next stage. We had now won all the interior ridges of the salient and the southern pillar, but we were not yet within striking distance of the north part of the main Passchendaele Ridge. To attain this, we must lie east of Zonnebeck and the Polygon Wood at the foot of the final slopes. Moreover, we must act quickly. We were well aware that the enemy intended a counterattack in force, and it was our object to anticipate him. We struck again on 26 September. The weather was fine, and for a brief week it ceased to be an element in the German defensive. Our front of attack was a 6-mile stretch from northeast of St. Julien to south of the Tower Hamlets. The new advance was as precise and complete as its predecessor of the 20th. At 10 minutes to 6, our infantry moved forward. On our left, the 58th and 59th Divisions pushed on both sides of the Belgy-Passchendaele Road to the upper course of the Hannebeck. In the center, after some sharp fighting along the Ypres Rulers railway line, the 3rd Division took the ruins of Zonnebeck village, which had been the apex of the salient when we evacuated it in May 1915. Farther south, the Australians carried the remainder of the Polygon Wood, while they also assisted the sorely tried 33rd and 39th Divisions on their right, which were struggling in the maze of creeks and trenches beyond Veldhoek. These divisions, though they had suffered one of the enemy's severest counterstrokes the day before, nevertheless were able to join in the general advance. One dramatic performance fell to their share. They relieved 2 companies of the Aragon and the Sutherland Highlanders, who had been isolated the night before and had held out for 12 hours in the midst of the enemy. The last days of fine weather were employed by the Germans in some of the most resolute counterattacks of the battle. The troops, which they had intended to use in their frustrated offensive of the 26th, were now employed to undo the effects of our advance. There were 7 attacks during the day, notably in the area between the Roselbex and the Polygon Wood. Then came a pause, while the enemy collected his shattered strength, and on the last day of the month he began again with 2 Flammenwerfer attacks north of the Menin Road. 5 more followed the next day in the same place, and 1 south of the Rulers Railway. Nothing came of them except the temporary loss of 2 advance posts southeast of the Polygon Wood. The last took place on 3rd October, close to the Menin Road, but it was broken up by our guns before it reached our lines. That night, the weather broke, and a gale from the southwest brought heavy rains. It was the old ill luck of our army, for on the 4th we had planned the next stage of the battle. But if the weather was ill-timed, not so was our attack. The enemy had brought up 3 fresh divisions, with a view to recovering his losses of the 26th. 10 minutes past 6 was his 0 hour, and by good fortune and good guiding, 6 o'clock was ours. Our barrage burst upon his infantry when it was forming up for the assault, and cut great swaths in its ranks. While the Germans were yet in the confusion of miscarried plans, our bayonets were upon them. Our objective was the line of the main ridge east of Zonnebeck, the southern part of what was called the Passchendaele Heights, along which ran the north road from Beeswaxcandle. Our main front was the 7 miles from the Ypres Salient Railway to the Menin Road, though we also advanced a short distance south of that highway. By midday, every objective had been gained. The achievement of Messine in the first day of ours was repeated. The enemy, caught on the brink of an attack of his own, was not merely repulsed. A considerable part of his forces was destroyed. The British left was directed along the Paul-Capel Road, in a country so nearly flat that the chief feature was a hill marked 19 meters. After a sharp struggle, we won this position, lost it, and regained it before evening. Farther south, we entered Paul-Capel village and occupied its western half. The valley of the Strumbig was a sea of mud, but the 48th Division forced its way across it. In our center lay the area of the projected German attack, the Grafenstaffel Ridge, jutting west from the Passchendaele Heights, and the center part of the heights themselves, the New Zealand Division struggling across the swamps of the Upper Hennebeck, took the village of Grafenstaffel and won the crest of the spur. On their right, the Australians carried Molenarkeshuk and Broodseide, and drove the 4th Prussian Guards from the ridge summit, pressing beyond the Besseler-Passchendaele Road. Southward again, the 7th Division traversed the crest and took Nordenhoek, while the 21st Division on their right took the village of Reutel and cleared the tangled ground east of the Polygon Wood. Thence, as far as the Menin Road, there was desperate fighting in the hollows of the Rudelbeck and the Polygon Beak, where the 5th Division stormed the Polderhoek Chateau. A little after midday, we had gained all our final objectives. We had broken up 40 German battalions and had taken over 5,000 prisoners, including 138 officers. The counterattacks which followed, there were no less than 8 between the Menin Road and Reutel, won back little ground. From Mount Sorel, in the south, we held 9,000 yards of the crest of the ultimate ridge, and our grip of the Grafenstaffel spur gave us a good defensive flank on the north. Above all, we had succeeded in nullifying Armand's tactics of defense, and we captured documents which made it plain that the German High Command were wavering and inclined to a return to their old method of holding their front line in force. Sir Herbert Plumer's leadership had been abundantly justified. But October had set in. Storm followed storm, and Haig had to reconsider his plan of campaign. Weather and a dozen other malignant accidents had wrecked the larger scheme of a Flanders offensive. Gone was the hope of clearing the coast or of driving the enemy out of his Flemish bases. What had been laboriously achieved at the end of 10 weeks had been in the program for the first fortnight. It was only a preliminary. The main objectives lay beyond the Passchendaele Ridge. The weather had compelled us to make our advance by stages, widely separated in time, with the result that the enemy had been able to bring up his reserves and reorganize his defense. Our pressure could not be cumulative, and we had been unable to reap the full fruits of each success. There was, therefore, no chance of any decisive operation in the Flanders area, and it became a serious question for Haig whether the Ypres operation should be continued. If October should bring the kind of weather which it had shown the year before on the Somme, the salient would be an ugly fighting ground. The extremity of Russia was permitting more and more German divisions to be transferred to the west, which would not make our task easier. On the other hand, we had not won the last even of the limited preliminary objectives, for we did not control the whole Passchendaele Ridge, and it might well be urged that, till we did, we had not secured our own position or made difficult the enemy's against the coming winter. Moreover, the French were preparing a great attack on the Esne Heights for the last week of the month, and it was desirable that the German mind should be kept engrossed with the northern line. Also, events of high importance were in train in Italy, and the attack towards Cambrai in November had been decided upon, which made it essential to fix the enemy's attention on the Flanders front. Balancing the pros and cons of the matter, Haig resolved to continue his offensive on a modified scale till the end of October, or such time as would give our men the chance of reaching Passchendaele. Footnote: in the last stage, from 5th October to 10th November, the scale of fighting was considerably reduced. In the last fortnight, the number of British divisions which attacked was approximately the same as the number used on a single day, the 31st July. End of footnote. The last stages of the Third Battle of Ypres were probably the muddiest combats ever known in the history of war. It rained incessantly, sometimes clearing to a drizzle or a Scots mist, but relapsing into a downpour on any day fixed for our attack. The British movements became an accurate barometer. Whenever it was more than usually tempestuous, it was safe to assume that some 0 hour was near. Tuesday, the 9th, was the day fixed for an advance on a broad front by both French and British. But all day on the 7th and 8th it rained, and the night of the 8th was black darkness above and a melting earth beneath. It was a difficult task, assembling troops under such conditions, but the thing was accomplished, and at 20 minutes past 5 in the dripping dawn of the 9th, our infantry moved forward. The operations of the 4th had bulged our center between Pol-Capelle and Besselaire, and it was necessary to bring up our left wing. Hence, though we attacked everywhere from the Polygon Wood northward, our main effort was on the 6 miles from a point east of Sonnebeck to the northwest of Langemarck, while the French on our left continued the front of assault to the edge of the St. John's Beck, south of Drailbank. In the north, the French and British Guards Division, advancing side by side, had won all their objectives by the early afternoon. Footnote: Antoine's First Army achieved excellent results at a wonderfully low cost. In its 3 months' fighting, it had only 8,527 casualties, of whom 1,625 were killed. End of footnote. They crossed the St. Jan's Beek, carried the hamlets of St. Jan Hook, Mangalar, Veldhoek, and Cooke, and established themselves on the skirts of the great Honthurst Forest, the northern pillar of the German line. South of the Ypres Salient Railway, the 29th, 4th, and 11th Divisions fought their way east of the Pol-Capelle-Honthurst Road and captured the whole of the ruins of Pol-Capelle. In the center, the Australians and the 66th, 49th, and 48th Divisions moved nearer to Passchendaele along the main ridge, taking the hamlets of New Welland and Keersenhoek. The day was successful, for our final objectives were almost everywhere attained, and over 2,000 prisoners were taken. It was Haig's intention to press on the advance, but the weather and the landscape were such that there was less hardship in going on than in staying still in lagoons and shell craters, where comfort or security was unattainable. The next attack was fixed for Friday the 12th, but the rain fell in sheets during the night of the 11th, and the movement was countermanded soon after it had begun. Nevertheless, we made some progress between the Royalist Railway and Honthurst Forest, and 1,000 prisoners were taken. Such fighting was the last word in human misery, for the country was now one irreclaimable bog, and the occasional hours of watery sunshine had no power to dry it. "You might as well try," wrote one observer, "to empty your bath by holding lighted matches over it." But Haig still kept his eye on Passchendaele, for the Cambrai preparations were maturing and the French attack on the Esne Heights was now drawing very near. So the battle among the shell holes and swamps continued. On the 22nd, we pushed east of Pol-Capelle and crept a little farther into the Honthurst Wood. On the 25th, we had a stroke of fortune, for a strong wind blew from the west, which slightly hardened the ground. On the 26th, the rain returned, but at 5:45 in the morning, we attacked on a front from the Rollers Railway to beyond Poldkapelle. From Passchendaele, the Bellevue spur runs westward, and between it and the Grafenstaffel spur is the valley of a brooklet called the Ravenbeck, a tributary of the Strombeck. Along this stream, the 4th and 3rd Canadian Divisions moved against the main ridge and won the little hill just south of Passchendaele village. Their left had a hard struggle on the Bellevue spur, where the old main Staden-Zonnebeck line of the German defenses ran. But the place was carried in the afternoon at the second attempt, and by the evening the Canadians held all their objectives. On the left of the Canadians, the 63rd Royal Navy and the 58th Divisions continued the advance in the low-lying ground north of the Bellevue Ridge. That day on our right, British troops entered Galvelt for the first time since the First Battle of Ypres. Their rifles, however, were choked with mud, and they were compelled to withdraw before the enemy's counterattack. On that day, the 26th, the French on our left were busy bridging the St. Jansbeck in its lower course west of Driebank. Their object was to clear the ground called the Merkin Peninsula, between the Blanket Lake, the Marchevard, or St. Jansbeck, and the Yser Canal. On the 27th, they were in action along with the Belgians on their left, who crossed the Yser at Nonnehoek. The Allies won the villages of Ashhope, Kippy, and Merkham, and reached the southern shore of the Blancard Lake. By the morning of the 28th, the whole of the Merkin Peninsula had been cleared of the enemy. This success menaced from the west the forest of Holdthurst. On 30th October came the attack on Passchendaele itself. At 5:50 a.m., in a clear, cold dawn, the 4th and 3rd Canadian Divisions attacked from the top of the Ravenbeck Valley and along the crest of the ridge, while the 58th and 63rd Divisions moved up the Padebeck Rivulet, which runs north of the Bellevue Spur. At 10 in the morning, the rain began again, and the strength of the enemy position and the desperate resistance of the 5th and the 11th Bavarian Divisions, which held it, made the day one of the severest in the battle. The Canadians won Crest Farm, south of the village, and carried also the spur to the west, and held it against 5 counterattacks. They forced their way into the outskirts of Passchendaele, but the appalling conditions of the Padebeck Valley prevented the Londoners and the Royal Navy divisions from advancing far, so that the Canadian front formed a sharp salient. But the end was not far off. Some days of dry weather followed, during which small advances were made to improve our position. At 6 a.m. on Tuesday, 6th November, the 2nd and 1st Canadian Divisions swept forward again, carried the whole of Passchendaele, and pushed northward to the Goodberg Spur. 4 days later, they increased their gains so that all the vital part of the main ridge of West Flanders was in British hands. We dominated the enemy's hinterland in the flats towards Rollers and Thoreau, and he had the prospect of a restless winter under our direct observation. The Third Battle of Ypres had wiped out the salient where, for 3 years, we had been at the mercy of the German guns. 3. The great struggle which we have considered was strategically a British failure. We did not come within measurable distance of our major purpose, and that owing to no fault in generalship or fighting virtue, but through the maleficence of the weather in a land where weather was all in all. We gambled upon a normal August, and we did not get it. The sea of mud which lapped around the salient was the true defense of the enemy. Consequently, the battle, which might have had a profound strategic significance in the campaign, became merely an episode in the war of attrition, a repetition of the Somme tactics, though conspicuously less successful and considerably more costly than the fighting of 1916. Since 31st July, we had taken 24,065 prisoners, 74 guns, 941 machine guns, and 138 trench mortars. We had drawn in 78 German divisions, of which 18 had been engaged a second or third time. But to set against this, our own losses had been severe, and the enemy had now a big reservoir for reinforcements. Already 40 fresh divisions were in process of transference to the west from the Russian front, apart from drafts to replace losses in other units. 3rd Ypres was the costliest battle up to date fought by a British army, for the casualties from 31st July to 10th November were in killed, wounded, and missing 230,000 men. For the gain of a trivial ridge and a few miles of mud, the price might well be deemed fantastic. But such a judgment would miss the true reason of the action. It was fought out of dire necessity, at the entreaty of France, lest a worse thing should befall. At all costs, it was needful to prevent a German attack in the west during the summer and autumn of 1917, while Buchan was nursing his armies back to health. On the whole, it achieved this purpose of distraction, as Ludendorff's own narrative bears witness. It delayed the attack on Divina, which was the end of Russia in the field. It delayed the attack on Italy, and when that came, diverted troops to Flanders that would have otherwise increased the danger at Caporetto. It gave France 6 months of ease and enabled Buchan to stage 2 highly successful small-scale attacks which restored the morale of his men. Above all, it gravely reduced the number of Germany's best shock troops and so benefited the Allies in their fiery trial of the following spring. If it be argued that it was too protracted and that the last stages might have been foregone, to point to the preparations for the Cambrai battle would seem to be sufficient answer. Haig had to fight so as to strain the enemy to the uttermost, and if in his effort he himself suffered heavily, he had counted the cost. Like Russia at Tannenberg, like France at Verdun, Britain at 3rd Ypres sacrificed herself for the common cause. One outstanding factor in the struggle was the superb endurance and valor of the new British armies, fighting under conditions which for horror and misery had scarcely been paralleled in war. To them the commander-in-chief paid a fitting tribute. Throughout the northern operations, our troops had been fighting over ground every foot of which is sacred to the memory of those who, in the first and second battles of Ypres, fought and died to make possible the victories of the armies which today are rolling back the tide, stayed by their sacrifices. It is no disparagement of the gallant deeds performed on other fronts to say that, in the stubborn struggle for the line of hills which stretches from Washut to Passchendaele, the great armies that today are shouldering the burden of our empire have shown themselves worthy of the regiments which, in October and November of 1914, made Ypres take rank forever amongst the most glorious of British battles. Ypres was indeed to Britain what Verdun was to France, the hallowed soil which called forth the highest virtue of her people, a battleground where there could be no failure without loss of honor. The armies which fought there in the autumn of 1917 were very different from the few divisions which had held the fort during the earlier struggles, but there were links of connection. The Guards, by more than one fine advance, were recompensed for the awful tension of October 1914, when at Gelleveld and Klein-Zillebek some of their best battalions had been destroyed, and it fell to Canada by the crowning victory at Passchendaele to avenge the gas attack of April 1915, when only her dauntless 2 brigades stood between Ypres and the enemy. The battlefield of the old salient was now as featureless as the Sahara or the mid-Atlantic. All landmarks had been obliterated. The very ridges and streams had changed their character. The names which still crowded the map had no longer any geographical counterpart. They were no more than measurements on a plane, as abstract as the points of the mathematician. It was war, bared to the buff, stripped of any of the tattered romance which has clung to older fields. And yet in its very grossness, it was war sublimated, for the material appanages had vanished. The quaint Flemish names belonged not now to the solid homely earth. They seemed rather points on a spiritual map, marking advance and retreat in the gigantic striving of the souls of peoples. End of chapter 82, part 3. End of A History of the Great War, volume 3. The Beleaguered Fortress by John Buchan.